Hidden behind an ivy-covered gate, in a village few maps remembered, there lived a garden that healed without asking for thanks. It bloomed for the broken-hearted and whispered to the weary. And in its center, Elspeth tended each leaf as though it were a story. If you are ready for a tale that blooms slowly, then listen close. Like and subscribe to Drowsy Archives for more quiet wonders. There are places even the wind forgets. Not out of cruelty, but simply because they ask for little attention. Wetherby Hollow was one such village, a quiet scatter of stone cottages nestled where the land softened into marshes. The ground was always a little damp underfoot. Shoes wore down quickly. Lanterns had to be relit more than once each evening. But no one complained. The stillness had its own kind of comfort. The marsh crept gently at the village's edge, not with menace, but with the patience of something ancient. Cattails and water hemlock rose tall in the distance. Frogs sang in the evening, and soft mists curled along the narrow paths each morning as though drawn with a brush. No cobbled roads ran through Wetherby, just mossy footpaths that changed shape after heavy rain. Visitors rarely came. If they did not stay long. The inn had 3 rooms, and 2 were usually empty. The bell above the bakery door had not rung properly in years. It had rusted into. Elspeth had lived in Wetherby Hollow for as long as anyone could remember, though no one could say exactly when she had arrived. Some claimed she had been born during a thunderstorm that never reached the ground, while others insisted she had simply walked out of the marsh one morning with a woven basket and soft shoes that never made a sound. She did not argue with either story. She lived behind the ivy-covered gate, in a cottage so overgrown with wild roses and climbing thyme that it looked like the garden had decided to keep the house rather than the other way around. Its shutters were crooked, its chimney wore a mossy cap, and the path to her door was always slightly damp no matter the season. Elspeth did not call herself a healer. She never wrote signs, took coin, or corrected the villagers when they brought her bread instead of thanks. She simply listened. When someone knocked at her door, and they always knocked gently, she would appear with warm tea already poured, as if she had been expecting not a person, but their sorrow. She rarely spoke above a whisper, and never wasted words on small troubles. But when she spoke, her voice was steady and slow, like the unfolding of a leaf. People said she had green eyes, though no one could quite remember their exact shade. Maybe they only seemed green because she spent so much time among leaves. Her hands were stained with soil that no soap could lift, and her apron always held the scent of dried lavender and nettle root. Children sometimes peeked through the hedges to watch her walk through the garden with bare feet, placing her palms on leaves as though they were old friends. People came to her with aching joints, tired minds, and grief that pressed heavy behind their eyes. She would lead them down the garden path, pause by a patch of feverfew or mugwort, and whisper to the plants before gathering anything. No one ever saw her take more than needed. No one ever left with more than they could carry. She never asked questions. She never promised cures. But somehow, those who left her garden felt lighter, as if something they had not spoken aloud had still been heard. The villagers said Elspeth could mend what doctors could not, that her tea could soothe more than the throat, and that no one cried in her presence without leaving a little stronger than they came. But Elspeth never claimed to heal. She just grew things, and listened, and waited for the garden to decide what was needed. In Elspeth's garden, the plants did not simply grow, they listened. Each leaf, each root, each stem carried stories. Some were old, too old for memory, and yet the garden held them gently. It was said that Elspeth spoke to her plants not with words, but with quiet presence. She would pass between the rows in the early hours, before the village stirred, her fingers brushing against petals as if reminding them that she still believed in their purpose. The garden itself had no neat rows, no signs, no plan that anyone else could understand. Calendula bloomed beside foxglove, the one healed and the other warned. Vines wove over fallen logs, and beneath them thrived small, hidden growths. Plants so rare that even the traveling herbalists had only read about them in worn scrolls. People said that when grief entered the garden, the rosemary would lean outward. That when worry lingered in a visitor's chest, the chamomile petals would widen slightly. When someone arrived carrying an old pain they could not name, a cluster of skullcap near the back gate would tremble, though the wind had not touched it. Elspeth never explained how she knew what to offer. She would simply reach into the shaded places between stones, lift a single sprig or pull a faded leaf from beneath a fern, and hand it to the one in need. There were plants in that garden that only bloomed after loss. Others thrived when someone remembered a kindness once given. There was one, a pale green herb with long curling stems, that only grew where someone had once knelt and wept. Elspeth never picked that one. She only tended it with soft glances and left a bowl of rainwater nearby. To most, plants were things rooted, useful, silent. But in Elspeth's care, they were more. They were companions in healing. Not servants to be harvested, but witnesses to be honored. Some remembered pain because someone needed to be reminded that they were not alone in theirs. Others offered relief, not by taking pain away, but by recognizing it. There were tales whispered among the village elders that Elspeth had once cured a child simply by having them sleep beside a patch of lemon balm for 3 nights. Another story claimed she had placed a willow leaf in someone's hand, and their nightmares never returned. None of these stories were ever confirmed. Elspeth would never say. But those who had walked the garden path could not forget the feeling. The strange, enveloping sense that the plants knew more than they should. That somewhere deep in the soil and the roots and the morning dew, there was memory. A memory that did not judge, did not question, did not speak aloud, but simply remained, green and alive, waiting quietly for someone in need. The garden behind Elspeth's cottage did not follow the rules of any book, but it had its own, silent, unspoken, yet always known. No signs marked them. No voice recited them. And yet every person who passed through the ivy-covered gate felt them settle into their bones, soft and ancient, like the hush of a cathedral or the pause before a lullaby. The first rule was perhaps the simplest: do not ask for more than you need. People who stepped into the garden sometimes came with desperation, aching for relief, for answers, for something to fix what could not be named. But the garden never responded to hunger. It responded to honesty. A sprig of sage might lean forward when someone admitted they were tired. A cluster of mint might sway toward someone who confessed they were afraid. But if one demanded too much, even with good intent, the plants would turn their leaves away. Elspeth never had to explain this. The garden did it for her. The second rule was stranger still: you must leave something behind. It did not need to be physical. Most often it was not. A quiet thought, a burden spoken aloud, a regret whispered under a rosemary bush. These were the offerings the garden understood. Sometimes, Elspeth would ask a visitor to hold a pebble in their hand while they spoke, and then place it at the base of a willow root. The act seemed small, but people left lighter. The garden, it seemed, accepted sorrow the way soil accepts rain. The third rule was never broken. No one entered in anger. It was not enforced by locks or signs. It simply did not happen. Those who carried sharpness in their heart could not find the gate. Even if they walked the same path, even if they had been there before, the ivy would shift and the turn in the lane would seem unfamiliar. The garden did not push people away. It merely made itself invisible until the person was ready to be kind. And kindness was everything. Elspeth once explained, in her own quiet way, that the plants responded best to gentleness, not just in action, but in thought. A rushed hand might break a stem that would have healed. A careless footstep could silence an herb for weeks. Those who walked the garden paths quickly, who sought answers without listening, found nothing blooming for them. Those who knelt, waited, and breathed with patience, those found more than they expected. There were other smaller rules. One did not name the plants aloud unless they truly knew them. One never stepped into the shadowed corner beneath the elder tree unless Elspeth invited you. And above all, no one ever picked anything without her guidance. To tend this garden was to learn humility. To be healed by it was to understand that some things grow slowly, and that not all things blooming are meant to be held. It was a place of trust. And trust, like all growing things, took time. The garden had no torches, no grand bonfire, no sweeping glow. Yet it was never truly dark, not even on the longest winter night or beneath the thickest fog the marshes could send. Here and there, tucked among the vines or hanging gently from crooked wooden posts, were lanterns. Dozens of them. Some were no larger than a teacup, others shaped like tulip bulbs or tiny green apples, but all shared one peculiar trait: they never went out. Their flames were not bright. They glowed more like softened stars than fire, muted and steady, casting halos that shimmered slightly in the breeze. The light they gave was not meant for vision. It was meant for feeling. Under their watch, people did not stumble. They did not lose their way. They simply felt safe. No one could say who had lit them. Not even Elspeth. She would sometimes walk past a lantern and touch its base, humming under her breath. But she never replaced their candles. Never filled their oils. Some villagers believed the flames were not real at all, but memory. kindness left behind by those who had once found healing in the garden. Visitors often spoke of the light before they mentioned anything else. They described it as warm without warmth, or a glow that did not cast shadows. One child said it felt like the way a lullaby sounds when sung by someone who truly cares. Another swore he saw the lanterns flicker to life when he stepped onto the garden path, as if they had been waiting just for him. The lanterns did not respond to storms. They did not sway when thunder rolled across the hills or when the wind howled down from the marsh. They remained still, serene, and unwavering. On nights when the moon was hidden, when even the village lamps were shuttered against the cold, the garden shimmered gently, like a constellation had fallen to earth and chosen to nest among the herbs. Some were strung between crooked willow branches by faded ribbons. Others hung from shepherd's hooks made of blackened iron, vines wrapped lovingly around their stems. A few sat in old bowls, cradled by moss, their glow barely visible until you knelt beside them. There were even some, small and pear-shaped, that hovered just above the surface of the pond, never sinking, never drifting, just gently lighting the water from within. Elspeth never offered explanations. But once, when asked by a curious boy why the flames never faded, she answered softly, "Because hope does not ask permission to shine. It simply does." The boy said nothing after that, only stared at the lantern nearest to him with wide eyes and a quiet heart. And so they remained, these little flames of comfort. Not to guide feet, but to steady hearts. Not to chase away darkness, but to remind all who entered that even in the quietest places, there was still light. There was something curious about those who found their way to Elspeth's garden. Many came with purpose. A pain in the chest that would not leave. Sleepless nights full of whispers. A sorrow that felt older than they were. And yet, as they passed through the ivy-covered gate, something always softened in their eyes. They forgot. Not entirely. Not forever. But just enough. Enough to loosen their grip on whatever burden had driven them down the narrow path past the chapel ruins. Enough to let the garden speak before they began their usual explanation. It was a quiet kind of forgetting, not confusion, not fear. More like the feeling of waking from a dream and realizing that the sharpness had dulled. The urgency had passed. In the hush of leaves and the gentle flicker of those ever-burning lanterns, people remembered something else. That they were tired. That they needed rest. That perhaps healing began not with answers, but with stillness. There was an old man once who came with his hand pressed tightly to his chest. He did not speak when he arrived. He only sat on the stone bench beneath the dogwood tree and stared at his fingers. Elspeth brought him tea, something steeped with wild rose and willow bark, and said nothing. He drank it slowly, watched the way the steam curled toward the sky, and after a long while he whispered, "I thought I came here to ask for something, but I cannot remember what." Elspeth smiled the way she often did, with her eyes more than her mouth, and placed a small, cloth-wrapped herb bundle in his hand. The man wept not because of pain, but because he realized he had not cried in years. Another time, a young woman arrived in haste, her boots muddy and her breath quick. She began to explain her troubles before the garden gate had even closed behind her. But the moment she stepped onto the garden path, her words faltered. The thyme rustled. The lavender leaned in. By the time she reached the bench beside the rosemary bush, she was silent. Not tense, just quiet. Her fingers traced the embroidery on her sleeves, and when Elspeth brought her a slice of lemon bread with honey, she smiled and said, "I think maybe I just needed a place to sit." That was the way of the garden. It did not require explanation. It did not ask for stories unless they were ready to be told. And more often than not, those who arrived full of questions left with fewer of them, but also with fewer weights. The visitors did not always know what they had received. Some left carrying a single dried leaf. Others carried nothing at all. But all of them felt something settle in their chest, something unnamed, but deeply familiar. They came looking for something to fix them. They left remembering they had simply needed to be seen. There came a day when the air above Wetherby Hollow grew heavy, not with wind, but with waiting. Clouds rolled in low and slow, not wild, not fierce, just wide, gray, and endless. They piled on top of each other like tired travelers and settled above the marshland like a blanket too heavy to lift. The villagers noticed, but did not worry. Storms came and went. The marsh knew how to drink rain, and the thatched roofs had seen far worse. But there was something peculiar about this one. It never began. The sky darkened, yes. The birds hushed. Even the frogs fell silent for a time. But no lightning cracked. No thunder chased across the hills. No rain touched the thatched cottages or the garden beyond the chapel path. It was a storm that arrived with all the signs of its coming, then lingered. And waited still. In the garden the air shifted. Elspeth stood barefoot beneath the elder tree, her apron dusted with petals from the lemon balm she had been trimming. She looked skyward, her eyes tracing the clouds with a calm that did not match their weight. The lanterns continued to glow, but more dimly than usual, as if even they were holding their breath. That day no visitors came. Even the most curious children stayed inside. The marsh paths turned soft, and the frogs hid deeper in their burrows. The only sound was the creak of garden gate hinges turning slowly in the wind. But there was no wind, only stillness. Elspeth moved through the garden differently that day. Slower, with more reverence, if that were even possible. She placed her hands on the soil, on tree trunks, on worn benches, as though checking each for a quiet heartbeat. Some said they saw her humming to a row of echinacea, though her lips did not move. Others believed she scattered salt along the hedges, or buried a jar beneath the lavender with a ribbon tied around its neck. But no one knew for certain. What was known, what no one forgot, was that the storm did not break. It pressed against the village for 3 full days, thick and unmoving, as if testing something unseen. The sun was a pale coin behind layers of cloud. Shadows vanished. Time bent. People moved slower, spoke softer. No one laughed. And yet, no fear grew in their hearts. Only patience. On the 4th morning, the clouds parted, not suddenly, not with drama. They simply loosened, as if they had remembered something and left quietly. The light that returned was soft and golden. The air smelled of mint and wet stone. And in Elspeth's garden, everything bloomed at once. Lavender opened even where none had been planted. Yarrow spread across stone steps. The willow tree wept with bright green leaves as though waking from a long sleep. The villagers did not speak much of those days. But when they did, they often said the same thing. It felt like the storm had come to ask permission, and been gently told no. Not everything in Elspeth's garden grew from seed. Some things were planted by hand, not to blossom, but to rest. In one quiet corner beneath the shade of the twisted hazel tree, just beyond the reach of the thyme beds, there was a patch of earth that Elspeth never disturbed. She did not weed it. She did not trim back its creeping ivy. And no one, not even the bravest children, ever stepped there. It was not forbidden, but it felt sacred. Long ago, though no one knew exactly when, Elspeth buried something there. A small clay pot, hand-shaped, sealed tightly with wax and wrapped in linen. She had carried it in both hands, as though it were fragile, though it made no sound when she walked. She dug the hole slowly, the garden watching her with a silence deeper than usual. She spoke no words, only placed the pot gently in the earth, covered it with care, and pressed her palm to the soil as if saying goodbye. Some believed it held herbs too rare to be used. Others whispered that it was the ashes of a great sorrow she had once endured. But one old man, who had known Elspeth as a girl, told a different story. A quieter one. He said the pot held a letter, written in ink so old that time itself could not erase it. A letter not meant for anyone living. A letter never meant to be read. It had been written, he claimed, on the day she chose to stop wandering and began tending the garden. The villagers, of course, had no way to know if the tale was true. Elspeth never mentioned the pot. She never spoke of letters or past lives. But when the wind blew a certain way and the garden fell utterly still, a few visitors said they felt as though someone else was there, not watching but waiting. Not near, but not far either. The garden never grew anything in that patch of earth. Not a single leaf. Not a single sprout. And yet, whenever rain came, it was the first spot to glisten. As if the soil remembered. One autumn evening, a young girl came to the garden carrying a locket and a tear-stained letter of her own. She did not know why she was crying. She only knew she needed to be somewhere quiet. Elspeth sat with her under the hazel branches. Said nothing. Offered no tea. Instead, she handed the girl a small, flat stone and a worn ribbon of dark green silk. The girl tied her letter with the ribbon, laid it on the stone, and Elspeth placed it, gently, in the earth above the old clay pot. No seeds were planted. No blessings were spoken. But that night, for the first time in memory, a tiny violet bloomed in the soil. Just one. It wilted by morning. But the girl left smiling. Because some things do not grow to last. Some grow simply to be seen. At the farthest edge of Elspeth's garden, where the lanterns glowed faintest and the path narrowed to barely a footstep wide, there grew a single herb unlike any other. It did not grow in clusters like thyme or wander like creeping mint. It stood alone in the curve of an old stone wall, surrounded by wild moss and soft ferns. It was small, no taller than Elspeth's hand, with pale green stems and leaves that shimmered faintly when the wind passed through them, even when the rest of the garden stood still. No one knew its name, not even Elspeth. She never clipped it, never touched it, never let anyone near it, not out of secrecy, but out of deep, quiet respect. There was no entry in her worn herbal ledgers about it, no pressed version between the pages of her old books. When asked, she would only say, "It came when it was needed," and say no more. The herb bloomed only once a year, if it bloomed at all. Its flower was small and silvery blue, delicate as breath, and lasted only a single night. Those who had seen it described the scent as something like memory and rain. Others said it reminded them of a place they had never been but somehow missed. A few swore it whispered. Not aloud, no. But when you stood near it, especially just before dusk, it seemed to hum. Not a sound exactly, but a feeling, as if it were singing into the soles of your feet and the center of your chest. Some called it the grief flower, others Elspeth's hush. A few herbalists from neighboring villages came asking to see it, claiming they could name it, categorize it, record it. But Elspeth never allowed them in. Not unkindly. She simply smiled her gentle smile and sent them home with bundles of lavender and lemon balm, as though that were answer enough. One child, bold and curious, once reached out to touch its stem. Just once. He was not scolded. He was not harmed. But as soon as his fingers brushed the leaf, he sat down in the moss and began to cry. Not loudly, not fearfully, just a long, quiet weeping, as though something forgotten had gently returned. When he finally looked up, Elspeth was already beside him, holding a soft cloth and a cup of warm tea. She said nothing. Neither did he. But he never touched the plant again. Years passed, and the herb remained. Always in that same corner, always untouched, always blooming when it chose. No insects landed on it. No frost ever took it. It existed outside of season, outside of explanation. And when asked gently and without expectation, Elspeth would only say, "Not all healing needs a name." It was the garden's final secret. A single green mystery left in the care of a woman who asked for no praise, in a place where even silence was alive with meaning. Time moved gently in Wetherby Hollow. Seasons changed like sighs, and nothing ever hurried. Children grew into adults who still remembered the smell of rosemary at Elspeth's gate. Visitors came, quietly, and left even quieter. And the garden, Elspeth's garden, continued, not as a place of wonder, but as part of the village's breath. Elspeth herself grew older, though no one could say how much. Her hair silvered, her steps softened, but her presence never faded. She still rose with the mist, walked the garden paths barefoot, and hummed beneath the elder tree. She still offered tea, still listened more than she spoke, and still knew which leaf or flower a soul needed before the soul did. And then one spring morning, she did not open her door. There was no fear in the village. No panic. Just a soft understanding, as though the garden had told them in its own quiet way. They gathered near the chapel ruins, not to mourn, but to sit. To listen. To remember. The ivy on the gate shifted just slightly, as though acknowledging each person who passed. The lanterns glowed a little warmer that day. And somewhere, near the hazel tree, the soil shimmered softly, though no dew had fallen. When they stepped into the garden, they found no absence. Only presence. Elspeth's chair still sat beside the patch of calendula, a folded shawl resting across its back. A fresh pot of thyme had been planted near the stone bench. And near the corner where the final herb still grew, someone had left a cup of tea still warm. The villagers did not ask questions. They simply let the stillness speak. And over the years, the garden lived on, not as a relic, not as a place of legend, but as something woven into their daily lives. People still walked the path when their hearts were heavy, still paused beside the rosemary bush, still left small letters beneath the hazel tree. No one claimed to be the next Elspeth. No one needed to. The garden did not require a keeper. It had been loved so gently for so long that it had learned to care for itself. New plants appeared where none had been planted. Herbs that once wilted in other soil flourished here without effort. The final herb, still unnamed, bloomed twice the next spring. The lanterns continued to glow without oil, without matches, without question. And the roots grew deeper. Not just in the soil, but in the people. In the way they spoke to one another. in the way they listened, in the way they began to believe that healing was not always about answers, but about tending, quietly, patiently, and without demand. So when travelers asked about the garden, the villagers would simply smile and say, "It is still there. Just follow the mist. And remember, do not knock. Just wait." Because the garden had never been about Elspeth alone. It had always been about what she gave it. Time, trust, and the kind of care that grows even after you are gone. And so, as the garden continued to bloom quietly beneath silver skies, its stories rooted deeper in the hearts of all who wandered through it. We come gently to the end of tonight's tale. If this soft journey through memory and healing brought you peace, do consider supporting the garden of stories we are growing here. Like the video to let the roots spread. Crescent Moon subscribe to Drowsy Archives so you never miss the next gentle story. Bell and ring the bell, softly of course, for your next calm adventure. Until then, rest well, dream kindly, and let the quiet stay with you. Good night.